Thanks, Jessica. Guess this is the last round of talks at CSSconf. So sad. Let's get the party started so we can go to the party afterwards. I want to first off say a big thanks to the organizers. They put together a beautiful, amazing, wonderful event. So if you guys could all give the organizers a round of applause. I owe them all so much for helping me out. So, and I'm completely honored to be up here with all of these other great speakers. I do have to give a quick disclaimer really quick. My slides do feature some like optical illusions and animations that if you feel like visual sensitivity, I will not be offended if you need to get up and like go outside and take a walk because you have to please take care of yourself first. I'll try to give you a warning before something visually animated pops up on the screen. But today we're going to talk about CSS and art history and all of the wonderful things that we have in common. As a front-end developer, we work in an industry where our job is to build things for public consumption. And the thing is that often like we're given sets of designs and photographs and text, and we have to put that all together in order to tell a story on a website. And what better place to look at for inspiration of visual storytelling than art history? So the object of art is not to reproduce reality, but to create a reality of the same intensity. Effective storytelling in art comes from a long, long history of patterns and symbolism and visual cues that have been developed over the course of time. And what's interesting is that today we're kind of in the opposite situation. Back in medieval times and in the Renaissance, illiteracy was the majority of, like, people weren't as capable of reading as they are today, obviously. And when we work on websites, our job is often to make text available and readable. However, we're still working in a two-dimensional medium. We're still working with a screen that has quite a lot in common with the canvas and with the frame. So during this talk, there's going to be a lot of like little examples of fun CSS things that I felt inspired to share with you. This is one of my favorite websites. It's actually in Flash, but I'm working on building a like CSS JavaScript version of it. But I just wanted to show you. This is animated and moves around a lot. It's a game called First Person Tetris. You can go to firstpersontetris.com. I waste a lot of time playing this. So instead of the pieces rotating, the whole screen rotates. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is because we often forget that, like, as long as we look at the physical world, the three-dimensionality of vision seems to offer no problem until we recall that the optical input for all of our visual experience consists of two-dimensional projections on the retina. Like, this is a game, but it's also a piece of art because it's a two-dimensional representation of space that you have a three-dimensional relationship with. Let's see here. I've only ever gotten to level 10, so if you can get past level 10, because it starts going really fast and then you get really, really dizzy. Woo. So let's see here. Like I was saying, we're dealing with like a two-dimensional world, right, on our screens. And our screens give us access to the same things that you have access to when you're putting together a painting. We have access to space and lines and light and color and all of these things that come together to make form, which is what we are talking about when we look at art history, is the nature of form. So let's break that down a little bit more. So this is a wonderful Georgia O'Keeffe quote that I love, where she's talking about what it is to make art. The reason why we elevate art is because art gives you the chance, it gives you a chance to have an intimate, emotional relationship with something. And that intimate emotional relationship comes from the arrangement of shapes and lines and color and all of these things that are just two-dimensional tools. And we have access to with CSS. They all contribute to expression. So starting back from like way, way beginning, these are cave paintings in the south of France from 30,000 to 32,000 years ago. It's kind of hard to carbon date these things. But you can see that there is already an understanding of form. Like there's white and there's dark, so there's an understanding of highlighting and saturation. There's movement. The animals are running across the rock, right? But just like early web design, before we had access to like Flexbox and CSS Grid and all these really cool things that we have now, just like in art history, CSS was used in basic motifs that were changed with trends across time. So cave paintings being the earliest, and then maybe you look at Greco-Roman vase art, and then you look at the motifs of medieval art. They're generally all sticking to the same motif in the same way that very, very, very early web development stuck to the same motif. But then we had the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was responsible for basically making us go from a representational form of art to a realistic form of art. And I believe that right now we exist in a sort of Renaissance period of CSS where we have access to all of these wonderful, cool new tools, but we're still doing the job of tradesmen and craftsmen. We're still dictated to us what it is that we're communicating through our web development onto the screen. Same as how the artists during the Renaissance were usually patronized by the Medici and the family, and the families in countries all across Europe. And one of the greatest contributions of the Renaissance to art was the concept of vanishing points. So a vanishing point is a geometrical representation of an expression of space. By locating a point on the horizon and pulling it into the foreground, you're able to create three-dimensional objects. So before, during medieval and like on Greek vases, you would see a very flat two-dimensional picture of a person. But now with vanishing points, we have the ability to truly understand space. And here you can see the very famous Last Supper, which was a fresco by Leonardo DaVinci. Here he takes great advantage of the vanishing point. But not only that, there's also hidden messages with this composition in and of itself. The fact that the vanishing point is centered and the horizon is centered is a method of demonstrating symmetry, and symmetry demonstrates perfection, because for two things to be equal on both sides, that is perfection. And back in the Renaissance, this was considered godliness. So we derive this expectation of perfection and centering, and it's probably why all of us have to struggle with vertical center alignment so much to this day, because of this crap. Here's a more intense version. If after looking at where the horizon exists and the vanishing point exists in the Last Supper, we can kind of take it to the next level with Raphael and his fresco, The School of Athens, which is in the Vatican. The vanishing point itself is actually between Plato and Aristotle, therefore centering our focus on the conversation that is happening between the two characters in the center. However, there's also lines of geometric form that are happening in the foregrounds, and with the crossing of the lines, we see that this is like a much more complex version of what was started in the Renaissance. Like, this is the growth of it. And you can do it with CSS. This is vanishing points being executed with perspective origin. And because my slides are all HTML and CSS, I can show you how I did it. So it's all this right here is how I'm able to execute the same thing that DaVinci and Raphael executed in my code. So using vanishing points also gives us access to depth, and in that same sense that we have access to depth with vanishing points, our screens are like windows. They're showing us what is within in the same way that a frame shows you what is within a painting. And this was the big movement that happened in the Renaissance and kind of defined art for the next few motifs into the Baroque period and the neoclassical period, which is still kind of happening today. I love this piece of art. Cannot pronounce his name. I wish I could. I'm horrible at pronouncing things, but it kind of looks familiar, right? Like, you've seen this pose before, except not on Law and Order SVU. And that's because it is a physical representation of Napoleon I at his coronation, painted by Ingres. So you can see here the artist Wiley took inspiration, and we're still like dealing with depth and dealing with these patterns, and we have an inherent cultural understanding of these patterns. Like, you understand that Ice-T is pronouncing that he is the king, but in the same way that Ice-T is copying Napoleon, Napoleon is copying God. This is Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. God the Father is a panel within an altarpiece with multiple panels, and you can see the similarities between God the Father and Napoleon. And we continue to use these similar patterns in CSS with the prevalence of hamburger menus and these representations that we all understand and have a user experience that is cohesive, and everyone across the board gets that. And so I think that as a community, we should always be aware of those choices that are being made and what that means for the future generations of web development and the things that we're passing along. But, you know, you don't need to go to school and get a master's degree to be an artist. Anybody can be an artist. Anybody can create things just like you can create anything out of CSS with your code. And I think that looking at the artists of today is going to help us figure out what the future of CSS looks like. After the neoclassical period, which was what we just saw with Napoleon, we had the advent of photography, and photography meant that we no longer needed paintings to represent real life, because with photographs, we could document real life much quicker, albeit slightly expensive, but not nearly as expensive as hiring an artist to paint something for you. At the same time, psychology was being developed, and people were being encouraged to explore their feelings and emotions. So during this period, that's when we had the birth of abstract art. And now we're looking at not the figure within, but the figure on. The canvas as a surface is just as important to look at in terms of art as the canvas as a window. And here we have a piece by Chuck Close. It's a portrait of Kara Walker, who's also a famous artist who I adore. What's interesting is that Chuck Close abstracts the portrait by painting individual watercolors, just like pixels, and therefore turning our focus away from the photograph as a whole and the image, the figure of Kara Walker as a whole, and instead we have a chance to focus on what is on the canvas and the texture and the color and the abstraction. And I think that we are going to see more and more of this in the future with CSS as we become more aware of the screen as a surface as opposed to a window. Little side trivia about Chuck Close. He has, bear with me while I pronounce this, prosopagnosia, which is face blindness. So when he paints these portraits, he will look at the photo and look back at the painting and go back and forth, and he actually like doesn't recognize the person while he's doing these paintings, which is why, like, what people have theorized is why his paintings seem so photographic, because he's so able to separate himself from the person who he's painting, and he just sees the elements of what he's working with. And in the same way that we work with pixels, and now we're working with like CSS grid and stuff, we can look at this piece and notice how it's being abstracted into something that is completely different from the way we used to handle art. And it ran across this very interesting piece that Ivana showed me earlier today. Using typography portrait by Carolyn Portugal, she uses typography and SVG animation to deconstruct and subvert the meaning of the text. So just like Chuck Close is subverting the meaning of the portrait, we can subvert the meaning of the text that we're given to display on a website to provide information, and we can provide information of our own making. Even more deeply abstracted, we can look at Mark Rothko's paintings of color. And when we look at these, what you don't know is that there's tiny, thin layers of color across the whole canvas. Mark Rothko would paint very, very thin layers over and over and over to develop this glowing lumosity. Something that I akin a lot to the fact that our screens are actually light glowing from behind. And so I like to look at Rothko and consider the fact that when we're creating something with CSS, oftentimes color and light have a lot to do with the expression and the emotion that is caused by what you're looking at on your screen. In 1816, Schopenhauer wrote On Vision and Color, which explained his theory of the physiological rate of intensity of color saturation, and he developed a spectrum of color that he deemed low to high to low intensity, with black on one end of the spectrum moving into violet, blue, and green. Green and red being the center, the highest contrasting, moving down into orange, yellow, and white. And you can see here, there's no green, there's no red. This is a very subdued painting with notes of violet and notes of blue, and we have a kind of calming sense when we look at this painting. The colors communicate to us a sense of peace. But when you look at something like orange and yellow, it drives up your heart rate. It gets you excited. It is full of intensity. And in the same way that you can abstract down a painting into color to express emotion, you can do so with CSS and the screen and color. We can't always look at color as it really is. Sometimes it's determined by the context. And here, light and color help to define space. But here, we have the absence of color. The absence of saturation helps us to define space. So this is a piece of optical art by Bridget Riley. She was basically the front runner of this art motif. And she was also the first woman to win an international prize in painting at the Venice Biennial in 1968. And what she's creating here is she's expressing movement by manipulating the surface and depth with the contour and saturation. This is something that we could execute ourselves with code by manipulating a line, by manipulating its curvature. And it creates a wonderful sense of tension and sense of movement across the page. Even though it's static, there's no movement in it. But as you look at it, it begins to kind of wave back and forth. And to give you a sense of how we can utilize these abstractions through code, this is a project that my friend Ainsley Wagner worked on, where she took sound and used it to manipulate an abstract representation with colors and light, and they did this wonderful performance piece that I love. So this is making art with code. This is like the most abstract that you can get. And as we move towards pure expression and away from our dependency on text and our dependency on like newspapers, derivative layouts with columns and rows of text, I hope that you all are a little inspired to go out and make something fun and interesting. Thank you.